So it looks like so far most people here have used analytics before, so you're probably familiar with some of the pieces here that you'll see today. But I just want to go through the basics, make sure everybody's got a good handle on what we're going to be looking at. So yes, it looks like everyone here has used analytics, which is great. Let me get set up here with so you can see my screen. All right. So as far as crosstabs go, this is going to be the subject of today's webcast. There are a couple of things that I want to mention. First, with any questions that you might have during this webcast, there is a Q&A panel in the WebEx program. If you have a question about something in specific that you've seen when I'm going through an example or we're working through a piece of this, please enter this here. I'll take half an hour at the end of the webcast to go through questions that you might have. Alternatively, if you have something that you're curious about when we're running it as for future that you might be working on with crosstabs, again, submit a question here. If it's something that is complicated, I may have you speak to the group, but we'll definitely want all of your feedback and questions. So again, submit them through the panel. What we're going to go through today, first is a crosstab example. We'll take a look at a crosstab in its basic section. We'll go through a few of the more advanced pieces of sorting data and how we can look at it in detailed form. I'll then go through an overview of crosstabs, when we'll use them, what sort of things we can do with them, where they're applicable, what types of data you may want to use a crosstab for. I'll then move into building a crosstab. So what steps we have to take to actually create a crosstab, what things we can do that are sort of above and beyond the minimum pieces that are necessary. We'll do a couple tips and tricks, just things that you'll want to remember when you're working with a crosstab. A couple of nifty things that may not be as simple, they're not the basic pieces that you'd expect to find in the manual, but things that are quite useful. And then we'll do best practices at the end, just a couple of things to think about when you're working with crosstabs, and then after that I'll take questions. So again, just make sure that if you have a question on anything, if you think it's simple, don't worry. This is a webcast that I want to make sure that the stuff that we're going over, you understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So what I'm going to take a look at first is an example, and we're going to look at encounters by provider. And we'll look at some of the subcategories of data, but I've got this set up already. I have this with the search, and I'm going to run this. Right now what I've done here is I've brought up a count of all of the encounters for all of the providers here that I have in the system at this time, with a couple of other fields added to the crosstab so that I can sort this data. So let's take a look at this in a greater detail. We can take a look at the provider for these encounters and what their specialty is. And you'll see here that if we wanted to look at neurosurgery, and then if we're only interested in providers who have neurosurgery as their specialty, and of course we'd expect then that their encounters would be based on neurosurgery as well. So let's select neurosurgery. And we've got one provider at this point. And we have a couple other things. We can look at some billing information here if that's necessary. Turns out this is all internal medicine. So we can remove that. Appointment type. So this is going to break down all of our encounters under our neurosurgery provider by the type. So we've got some acute, some brief, chronic, but it looks like for the most part acute is the largest by total number of encounters here. And then if I want to break this out further still, we can set this up to look at the number of encounters by provider specialty and appointment type, and then by date. So in this range, we're looking at just the early part of 2007, so see from January 23rd until the 1st of February. And for this provider, that's all of the appointment dates that we have in this system. And I know that in this case, this is not realistic, given that typically for any one provider, you would see a lot of information here. If you didn't have your encounter date and time in a smaller format, in the case of maybe a month or two. And of course, we can see that this guy's essentially got the same encounters every day, just because this is a test system. But we've broken this down. We can see in a very detailed manner the count here for this provider and this information. And from here we can actually go even further and we can look at the specific information. So if we want to look at the 26th of January, these 6 appointments that he had, we can do a drill through. We're going to do a defined worksheet. This is a worksheet that I've already created to work with, set up with this Crosstab, and now I've added in a little bit of information that's going to show me just what I need to know about these appointments and who they were for. So I've said, all right, the provider we know is Ron, appointment type, that's fine. The date, again, this is what we'd expect because we selected that one specific date. And then the patient name and the patient's age. So you've got the option here, and of course we could add further fields on, again, depending on what information we're interested in. But we have the option to use worksheets to look at defined information for any crosstab that we've worked on. So navigate back to our analysis tab. Let's add in all of our sections again. Let's change out the date and put the appointment type. So if you wanted to look at all of the information first by provider and then their specialty and then by appointment type. So we can scroll through here and see that for immunizations, for neurosurgery, we've got these 7. And of course, the same is for family medicine and ophthalmology and general surgery. But again, we have a lot of options in terms of how we can view this data, how we can sort this data. Again, if we want to do a specific piece here, we can minimize this and say we only want immunizations, and we'll hit OK, and then this will bring us down to any providers, again, any specialty for those providers, but as long as their encounter type is an immunization, this will show up here. So that's some of the stuff that we can do here within the Crosstabs. Just an example. So, as a bit of an overview with the Crosstab, this is available through the Ad Hoc tab. I'll close out of here so you can see this. We'll go into Analytics Analysis. You open this up and you'll see the same screen with no information here, and we haven't added any dimensions to it yet. But as an overview, Crosstabs are set up as a sorting tool. They're going to allow us to summarize data. And I'll explain this in the context of the example that we've already seen. But what we're looking at is a common factor. What we saw before was the performing provider for an encounter, but a common factor is the primary care provider, the ordering provider, or maybe the prescribing provider. So you'll often find that as your summary. I want to know all of the information that's available, but as sort of the first layer of sorting, we're going to split it out by some type of provider. Of course, there are lots of other fields that you can use to sort by. Site location is quite common. Pharmacy name, if you're looking at medications and you want to see, sort of how they're sent out, what the percentages maybe that go to each pharmacy. Obviously, if you're in a small town, you won't see much, but in a city, you could plot that if you were interested. Provider specialty. We'll take a look at a little bit later on. We saw a little bit of it here, looking at the providers and what specialty they were. Again, that can be a large sorting tool when we're doing our high-level summary. The next piece of a crosstab is being able to slice and dice data. This is what we do with all of the other fields that we worked with. So you saw the encounter date and time, the encounter type. Those are all available to us, and they allow us to look in, and we can do this at multiple levels, at the data that we've already summarized. So if we set up primary care provider, and then we added in provider specialty. So we want to see, by primary care provider and then by specialty, how many encounters they're working on for each type. Or you could set up as an encounter type and look at the percentage of any given provider's appointments where that type fits into a certain category. When we're slicing and dicing, you notice that we can set up rows and columns, and we can select any given piece of that data. So we could select all of the provider specialties if we were interested, or we could select only one of them. And we can drill down using these tools to any specific field value. So if you want to use the whole field, that's fine. If you only want to look at 3 specific site locations, you can do that. And that sort out any, in this case, if we're looking at providers, any of the providers who don't have encounters at that location will not go up. So again, you have a lot of options as to how we can both view this in terms of what you actually see and how you view this in terms of the data that you actually see. So that sort of the specific values of this piece is that we can look down by a single provider or a single specialty or a single pharmacy if you're interested in that. Maybe you want to look at some medications that are restricted and see where they've gone. That's one of the things that you can use that specific value, select the drug class type, and then take a look only at those and see which providers have prescribed those and which pharmacies they were sent to. The next piece is the drill through, which again is something we saw. We were looking at the worksheets with specific data on one of the counts of, in this case, encounters, where we wanted to find out more information about the patients in this case, because we've got encounters. Obviously there's a provider, but we already know who that is. And we want to know a little bit about the actual encounter and who the patient was. So you can create a worksheet and drill through to that, and any specific cell that you click on, it will give you data. So it's done a very, very specific search, and it brings that up, and then you can add fields if necessary. You can create defined worksheets, which is what we used in the example. So if you've got a crosstab that you use, say with 5 or 6 different searches, and you've got a couple of worksheets that you really want to be able to pull off that, and you can do that and set those up so your searches are associated to the crosstab and your worksheets are associated to the crosstab, so everything's there and ready for you. So you could have some patient information, the very detailed information about the encounter, all sorts of stuff that you might want at a more detailed level than would make sense to do in the actual crosstab, because putting in patient name and so forth as a summary field would be a bit of a mess. And then the last piece is top and bottom, and you can view only the top or bottom X number of values based on a percentage of the total. So you can do all of your encounters, by provider, and let's say we only want to look at the top 5. And so you've set this up and said, all right, I want to know the providers who have the top 5 number of encounters for a specific appointment type. And you may only end up with 2 different providers, and I will get into this, but it's only going to select those fields which are available as far sort of into the crosstab as you've gone. So if we add in the appointment type, those 2 providers might split it up 2 and 3 appointment types each, in which they're the top. They have the greatest number of encounters for those given categories. So that's it can be a little bit odd when you first use it, but it is something that we'll take a look at when we go through to build the crosstab. So I'm going to stop and do another poll here. We've got this one looking at just whether you've explored in the Works database. Some of you who may use analytics primarily, you'll find that it's not necessary that you be in the Works database in that, sort of even in the clinical side. While others of you may say, yeah, I write queries in there all the time. It looks like so far most of you have used or have at least explored in Works, so you probably have a little bit of understanding about where all the data is coming from, where it's going between the different tables. So that's good to know. It's always useful to have a decent understanding of where our data is moving to and from, especially when it comes to things like encounters and setting them up for, whether you're looking at just arrived encounters or future encounters and so forth. All right, so on to creating a crosstab. And there are minimum requirements. There are only 3 of these, and then there are additional options which we'll go through one at a time. But for minimum requirements, this is the row dimension is our summarizing field. So this, we'll rebuild a similar crosstab to the one that we looked at in the example, where we were looking by provider or by performing provider who had a given number of encounters. So that's going to go into our row dimension. So go into patient encounters, and I'm going to go down and find, where is it? performing provider. So we'll set this up just by name for the beginning. Next piece is the data field. And this is what the Crosstab is going to be looking at as sort of the individual piece, what we're going to be counting or looking at the data for. And since we want to set this up with an encounter, we're going to look in here in this encounters section and we'll find the encounter ID, because we want to use the most unique, well, I guess if it's unique there's no more or less to it, but we want to use the unique value so that when we count this we'll get a good, accurate count. So we'll go up and find, I have to find encounter ID. Fields is sometimes a bit slow. In here. There we go, it's right there. So we'll drag this over to data fields. One thing that you'll notice here, and this is important, is this aggregate type. Patient encounters encounter ID. This is kept as a numeric value, and so analytics is going to assume the first time you do anything with a numeric value that you want to add this up, and that's not actually want to do. If we set this, it's going to take by our performing provider all of the encounter IDs that it has, and it's just going to add them up. And so it'll say we've got millions or tens of millions of encounters, and clearly that's not true. So if you right click on this, and you can do it anywhere in the field, and go down to aggregate type, we'll set this as a count. And so this is just going to count the unique values that show up in the encounter ID field. And then, given that you've all used analytics before, we know that the last piece for anything that we do in analytics is a search. All of our worksheets, all of our charts, everything requires a search. And I've still got a search open, but I'll show you what I've set up here. A very basic patient encounters, appointment status, and I think that's his name, yep. And we've just set this to arrived. So all of the encounters where the status set to arrived is what we're going to be looking at. And we know this is ready because we can hit the play button, and we do this, and now we see all of our data being counted up here. We've got most of our providers who have a fairly similar set of appointments. We've got George here who's knocking them out of the park, but this is at its very basic level, the Crosstab. We've set up our summarizing data, which is our performing provider. We've set up the encounters. We said that we want to count them, and we've told it to search for appointments where the status is arrived. And so now you can see the setup here for all of this. And what I'd like to do now is we'll go into some of the extra pieces that you see with a Crosstab, because we have a lot of other things that will make working with this data a lot more useful. You know, seeing this is wonderful. It may be all you need to know, but there are a lot of other things that we'll want to see here. So next on the list, we're going to go through slice dimensions. This is that sort of slice and dice data, what we're going to be looking at, you know, in a deeper level. So we're going to add a couple pieces up here to the slice dimensions box. Close the encounters section for now, and let's add in some information about our patients. Let's add patient age category. let's add patient sex name, and then if let's say we're curious on where the patients come from, and we'll grab patient city. So we've added a couple pieces, and then we'll click run again, and you'll notice that this looks almost exactly the same as what we had before. You've got your performing providers and your count of encounters. But we now have these three fields, and you'll recognize these as what we just added, that now show up in this bar here. And this is going to allow us to slice and dice the data. So if we want to find out patient sex, and this is going to divide up all of the encounters that we have into whether, first by provider, and then by whether the patient seen was male or female. And so you'll see, again, we've broken this up. We see the 172 for Jan O'Brien, 116 females to 56 males. And then, of course, our total down at the bottom is going to be the same total that we had before. If we were only interested in seeing how many men, we have some blanks here, how many men came in for appointments, and you can view only this. And you'll see that, okay, 861 out of, I think there were about 24 or 2,500 appointments total. And this might make sense. This is one of these pieces that you'll always want to think about whenever you're working in analytics is the data that I see, does this make sense? If you're a women's clinic, then this might not make a lot of sense at all, because why do you have male patients showing up? If you're a very general hospital, then perhaps you'd wonder why you had so many fewer males coming in for appointments. But it's always something to keep in mind when you're looking at this data. And then let's add in patient age category. And you probably saw how when I drag these in, there's a green line that shows up. And you'll see it here either as a vertical line, which is going to set these up as a row dimension, or as a column dimension when I get that long horizontal line. And you're going to see the same data no matter how you set it up. It's just going to show up in a different visual format. So right now, instead of having, for men, all the age categories that they fall into coming out, and then for women, and then men for Jeff Bones, seeing all that, we're just going to look at this in a bunch of different columns. So again, we can scroll down. Any of these patient age categories that show up means that somewhere within this crosstab there's a value in one of these categories. So it turns out that we have one patient between 0 and 5. Other than that, if we excluded all scripts test from the provider list, you'd see that this category would disappear. So it's not going to keep on categories if there's no data involved. But we can see here that all of these are represented fairly well by our providers, and you can look at the breakdown. So it looks like in this case for women, being that for this provider, for Jeff Bones, they outnumber men by about 2 to 1. And yet you see in the 18 to 49 category, it's more of a 3 to 1 ratio. So you say, all right, given the types of services we provide, that makes sense. We've got an emphasis on, maybe women's health, and so you'd expect that the women there would come in more regularly. For 50 to 64, apparently that's when the men come in, because they're represented both as the greatest of all the categories here, and being the one category in which they show up more than the women. So again, we've just set this up in a slightly different visual style, but we're going to take a look at the same data, and you can think about this as, as you move across in age. We expect the bulk of our patients, to be in the 18 to 49 category, and then it sort of peters out as you get out into the upper age groups. So we can drag this back up. Now let's add in patient city. We'll do this first as a row dimension to see how many different towns we're likely to get, and I'm not seeing all that many varying, so we'll set this up instead as a column dimension. So we've got somebody here who's listed, again, under an all scripts test with no towns. But we can see the primary number of towns here. If you're familiar with the Vermont area, you'll recognize a lot of these names. But these are all of the patient cities that are listed. So all of the patients that we saw for men or women, we're not looking at age category here, but this is broken out by where their city is listed as. And we can get rid of some of these. So we'll get rid of any town in blank. We'll get rid of the misspelled Burlington. Now let's say we don't need anyone from Essex either. Or the misspelled Williston. So we've brought a few down in here. And again, we can just take a look at this data and say, all right, this makes sense given where our clinic is. If you've set up a search that looks for a specific area, a specific site for these patients, or for these encounters, sorry, then we'd expect, okay, Burlington would be highly represented, because this site's set up for Burlington. If you wanted to, you could set this up as your site location. Here's your primary summary, and only select the one that you want, and then add in as many other categories across here as you'd like. So I'll add all of those back in. And then we'll toggle back, and you'll notice that things have now changed here in our crosstab. We've seen that patient age category is the only slice dimension we still have. Patient sex name has now moved down into the row dimensions. And if we toggle back, you'll see, all right, anything that's dragged into this section is going to show up under the row dimensions when we toggle back to our edit screen. Likewise, anything in this new row, when we toggle back, that patient city is now over in the column dimension. And it's certainly possible when you create your crosstab, if you know exactly how you want it to look, you know what order you want all of your slice dimensions to be in, then you can drag these fields directly into row dimensions or column dimensions, and then anything you leave in slice dimensions isn't going to show up until you drag it down into the crosstab. So that's the slice dimensions and column dimensions. What we can look at next is the top and bottom. That was what I'd mentioned, where if we want to look at the top 5, top 10, or bottom 10 if you want. We use this section here. I'm going to move these fields back up to the slice dimensions for now. And let's select the top 10, and then we're going to specify the field. And of course, we only have one choice here. This is going to look down into the data fields area, because it's going to look for by encounter ID. And if we run this, you'll notice that we only have a few providers who show up here. We don't see the 10 that we typically see. And then I'll explain what's happening here. You'll see this with all of the fields that you've added. So we can see that for these 4 providers, they have a grand total of 3 age categories between them. They have both male and female set up here. And it looks like only one city. So while this is a bit confusing to look at, you'll see that George Irwin here has, for the age category of 6 to 17, 1 and 1 here. If you add in 2, 3, 4, he accounts for the 4 of those 10, and then each of the other providers by 2. So what this has done is it's given us the top 10, but it also includes all of the slice dimensions that you've added into your crosstab. This is why I mentioned that this is not the easiest piece to use in a crosstab, especially the first time you start to do something with it. You'll see and be like, hey, you know, I thought I asked for the top 5 or the top 10. How come I'm not seeing any of this when it comes out? And what it's really looking for is once you've added in all your slice dimensions, this is going to be your top number. And so we can, you know, and if we look at these, the actual number of encounters here is going to be based on all of this information, and of course the totals are in here, so you'll have to disregard that these 3 are actually the same 3. But these are going to be the top 10 by value for these 10 categories. So if I drag this back out, we can see that indeed only these 4 providers account for the top 10 when we've used all of these slice dimensions. You can also use this as a percent, and this will give you a slightly different setup here. Obviously we can see that we've got, I think, how many of our providers there, but this looks at the percent of the total when you're looking at this. So again, a lot of options when it comes to doing this. I'm going to pull this out for the time being, but you can use that when you're looking for, you know, maybe the best or the worst. If you're doing some information by provider and how they're doing with using some part of the EHR, and you say, hey, we want to see who the top 10 and bottom 10 providers are, and see if we can, you know, little congratulations for the top 10 and maybe a little bit of a push for the bottom 10. I'm going to pause for a minute and we'll do the next poll. Just looking at what your role is related to the Allscripts EHR project. So whether you're working as an application analyst or a reporting analyst, if you're the DBA, are you the project manager for this, or the physician champion? Are you working, you know, more on the clinical side but working with the technology, or the technician or technical lead? It looks like we've got a couple of analysts or DBAs and some tech people here, which is good to see. We'll pull up the screen again so that we can continue on. And then the last piece that I want to mention here under the additional options is expressions. And you can set up an expression here to look at just about anything that you can write the SQL for. It's not necessarily going to be quite what you type into Management Studio if you're used to using that. But we have up here, it looks like a little magic wand, you know, casting a spell, called the Expression Builder. And we can add in a couple of things here. There are 2 ways that you can do this. If you want to use existing fields on the crosstab, you say yes, and that's going to allow you to build using any number of data fields that you have in here, and that's not what we want to do in this case. And then no will allow us to use any of the fields that we have in the meta layer tree. So what I'm going to look at in this case is a fairly common expression. This is great when you're looking at medications, encounters, things like that, but what this is going to do is look at the distinct number of patients that we see for any given thing. So if you're looking at medications and you want to know how many prescriptions have been written and how many patients they were written to. So you say, this provider, Jim, has written 36 prescriptions in the past month, and they went out to 28 different patients. And say, all right, that makes sense. You can also, if you see that they went out to 3 patients and Jim is not, he's more of a general practice kind of guy, and you say, that seems a little odd. We might want to look and see what he's actually writing here. So we'll give this a caption. We'll hit parse. This is expression passed, and we'll hit OK. And you'll notice that this now shows up in our data fields. And we'll run this. And this shows us the number of patients that make up all of the appointments here. I'm going to do a quick toggle back so that we don't have the decimals here. To change this, we can go into Set Up Data Fields. Pardon me. We'll grab this. And that looks a little better. So now we see that for Jeff Bones, he has 24 patients who came in and made up 163 of his appointments. And then we can further break this down if you want, and this will continue to run on any column that we've set up here. So for all, this one patient came in for all 3 of the encounters that make up Peter's age 6 to 17 category. And this is a very useful expression. If you're not familiar with SQL, or if you don't remember this expression is available on the Galen Wiki at wiki.galenhealthcare.com. If you search for analytics, you'll then see there's some links there, and under Crosstabs there'll be a section that has little tips like this, and it'll give you the expression and how to set this up if you've forgotten. So again, if we want to look at how many, in this case for Peter, 3 patients make up all of these encounters for men. Likewise, 15 for Jeff make up 105 of the women's encounters, but only 9 men make up the 58 encounters for all of the guys. So that's a very useful expression that you'll see. There's one other piece that I'd like to run through, and that's just setting up a percentage. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to run this because we can run the percent expression from here. You'll see here that we've got a little percents piece. It says percent of column or percent of row. And you have options here depending on how you've got your data set up. But we want to be able to look at this as a percent of, in this case, let's say column. And we'll select the column that we have. And this now shows us, all right, this patient or this provider, his 163 encounters make up 6.63% of the total encounters that we see under this search. So, maybe Peter is a traveling provider. He only comes in once a month, and all of his patients see him on one day. So that would explain why he's only got 0.2% of the total number of patients for this period. But you can use these, and again, if you get into advanced work, you may want to do percent of row, or if you have other data fields in here that you want to work with. But again, any expression like this is going to continue to work no matter what fields we use. So if we're dragging in things like this, all of this will show up. And it makes it a little easier to read sometimes when you say, all right, I recognize that this, is greater than all of these, that's going to be the total. So all of, Jeff Bones female encounters make up 4.27% of the total number of appointments here. And then the next thing that I want to go through is that defined worksheet that we saw. So let's look at 6 to 17 for Jeff Bones. If you right-click on this cell and go down to drill through, you'll see a couple of pieces here. We have to worksheet and to worksheet with additional fields. So let's say to worksheet with additional fields. And this is going to give us everything that we've included right now. And we don't need this. We don't need the encounter ID, so we'll get rid of that. Let's pull out city, patient sex name, and patient age category. We'll keep the provider name. And let's create a little worksheet here. So let's go into encounters, and we'll find encounter date time. Let's add that in. And let's see, I know there's an encounter type in here. And where's encounters, encounter type name? That's what I wanted. And then let's add in some patient information. So let's grab patient's full name, patient's age, and patient's sex. Oh, double-clicked on that. And then we'll run this. So this is now changed. We can make some edits to any of this. So we can call this, we'll call this performing provider. Any of this stuff is available if we wanted to see if the performing provider was the same as the provider for their primary care provider, then we could do that. In this case, we see that these are all appointments. But we can say type, and patient full name, name, patient age. All this stuff is available for editing. But let's say that we're going to use this as a defined worksheet, and we want this to look a little bit nicer than it currently does. So we'll give these columns all of their proper names. We'll set this one up as center that. Works a little better. Same with type. But we've got most of the information here that we needed. Don't want that. All right. That looks a good bit better. And of course, because we set these up, to search for our age category of 6 to 17, and for the female patients, this all looks good. And if this is something that we're going to use a lot in the future. So we've set up our thing. This shows us all the information for these patients. And this isn't going to let me save this from here. I'd forgotten that it does this, and for this I apologize. But typically what you can do is create a worksheet So we know, we'll say that this is what we wanted to use for our worksheet, and we've got this information. So we'll close out of the analysis and we'll go into the worksheets and we'll create this and save this. And I'll show you how we can do this. How we can add this as a defined worksheet. Let's see. So you go into drill through. Hold on. Typically this will show up where we have the add or remove drill through worksheets to this crosstab. I think it's perhaps because I haven't saved this yet. So if we save this, we'll just call this. We've got some related searches which we can set up. I see that I've got a GW one here. I know that I'm going to use this, so I've set this up as a search. I'm not going to bother with that now. And now you'll see that we have this add or remove drill through worksheets. And so if we'd saved the worksheet that we wanted to use here, we'll do something like this. We'll create it, and then we'll go into this window, add a drill or remove if we have any drill through worksheets. So we'll say, okay, basic patient info, and this now shows up in here, and we say exit, and that's great. So now if we toggle back and we have a drill through, you'll now see that the drill through to defined worksheet is available to click on. I've set this up, we hit OK, and it says that this has been loaded. That's fine. And now this is going to show us this information about the 65 encounters that we had here. And of course, we've got a little bit different information than what we might want. But again, this is something that you can create, and you can add as many of these as you need to. But this is available as an option for looking at detailed view. So you've got a lot of ways here in which you can look at data, how we can sort data, in as many categories as we need using the slice and column dimensions. We can look at the top and bottom pieces if you're interested in that. There are some suppression pieces here if you don't want your row or column totals or grand totals to show. If you're going to be exporting this data and doing some work in Excel, you might not want to have to pull all those out, so you can use these to hide the values that you don't want to see. And then we've got all these options as to looking at stuff with the defined worksheets and so forth. But a lot of different pieces here when it comes to putting this together. So, a couple of tips. Data fields. Set this to count. You'll notice that we had to change this. Obviously the percent, anything that you do with the expression builder or through the percents if you're using it on the actual crosstab screen, this will show up the way you want it anyways. But you'll see that we have a bunch of aggregate types here, and honestly count is the one that I see all the time. That's what you want to do. And of course we can change this. We can say aggregate type sum just to see what happens. And if we break this out, I'm pretty sure that Jeff didn't have 703,000 encounters, especially given the data that I have in here. So it's definitely important to make sure that your aggregate type here is count anytime that it shows up as sum. Expand and collapse. This is a piece that you can use, especially if you have 10 or 12 slice dimensions in here and you've started to, you've dragged out all these pieces. You can use these buttons here and they'll collapse this one at a time. And again, depending on how many pieces you might have there, you can also use this, and this is going to collapse everything up and sort of up and to the left, and this one's going to expand everything. Right now I don't have any column dimensions, but if I had, if I set these up as, oops, so I've got all of these, and then I can collapse these as much as possible. So that's just another option when you're working on things and you want to do a quick thing without having to drag it out of your Crosstab. You can do that. Percent of column and row. This is great for anytime you have you want to look at things at sort of a higher level. Obviously I've got a bit more information here than I probably need, but we'll just say for this basic information, you'll see a range of percents for the providers, but you want to make sure that they're all within an expected range, at least the providers that are here on a daily basis. Obviously test all scripts and user test, but Peter Albright, he's the traveling one. We don't expect to see him all the time, and therefore we don't expect him to have that many encounters as a percentage of the whole. But the rest of them, you say, all right, they look pretty good, and George, he's just crazy, he works all the time. Check fields for proper data. And this is true of most pieces of analytics, but you'll notice that when I was looking in encounters, there are a lot of fields in here, and there are a lot of fields that look very similar. So you might say, all right, is it the performing provider? There's billing provider. There are a whole bunch of different provider fields in here. There are all sorts of, sometimes there are locations, place of service. Is that what I want to use? Do I look at location name or code? I think there's some site information in here as well. So when you're building your Crosstab, you might build this out, and let's say, place of service name. All right, well that sounds kind of like where an appointment would take place. So let's use this Show Distinct Values tool. If you right-click on the field and then select Show Distinct Values, all I see is N. So I know that's not really what I want. And then we'll go look at location name. Okay, and I say, well, that's not what I want either, because I know I want some values in here. So use that tool. Use the Distinct Values tool, because that is great when it comes to knowing if you're using the right field. And of course, some of you will know, from your experience, either in Works Database or in the clinical application, exactly what field it is that you want. But sorry about that. But that's a very useful tool within analytics. The last piece is the count function. And that's up here above where it says dimensions. It's got a question mark and a little 1, 2, 3. And this is, as it says, returns the amount of rows for the current search and analysis. And it says this will return 2459. This value is not aggregated. So with a Crosstab, when you run this, it's going to go through and think of all of these things. You notice that whenever we work with the slice dimensions, I can just drag and drop them, and it doesn't have to think again. It's run through all of this. All the possibilities of how I want to sort this, it knows all of that already. And so if you're doing a very complicated Crosstab, you may find that with 10 or 12 different slice dimensions in here, and maybe you've got a couple column dimensions already. Maybe you've got some link groups, and there are a bunch of things. This could take a while, especially if your search is something that's more broad. So you might use this and say, all right, this is going to return 550,000 rows, and we just want to make sure that we're not running this needlessly, because you only have to run it once. So think about this when you're going through and building your Crosstab. What fields am I going to need? What values might I want to sort by? Anything like that. You have these options, but you'll want to do all of that building first and then run it. So that's going to move into the best practices. Labels and organization. When you're working in here, you can't rename your fields like you can in some other portions of analytics. So think about who your users are. Are they going to understand what you're looking at or what they're looking at? Will they know how all this data is sorted? Do they understand that you've only looked at a given site? They're not going to see the search. If you export this, or if you've got this set up in a dashboard, maybe they probably won't know what you've done. And you want to make sure that, one, you know who's going to be looking at this. Are they going to be more interested in seeing percentages of the total, or would they prefer to see the detail and then broken out? Likewise, don't add too much data unless you know your audience is going to understand what's happening. Do they know that you've broken all these out by provider and specialty and appointment type and so forth? Will they do they want to see all this detailed data? You've exported this to Excel and that's what they want. So again, just think about who the final audience for your data is and how well they're going to understand what you've put together. Again, utilizing all the slice dimensions. This is what I'd mentioned before. Running this query, so set up all of the fields that you want to add first and then run it. It'll save your database some hits. You only have to do this once. The server will thank you, and it'll probably save you some time because you're not hopping back and forth and running it. On my system, it doesn't take very long because I don't have a lot of data. On your system, you'll probably find that there's way more, and your Crosstab may take several minutes to run, depending on what you've set up. Create templates. This is great because in analytics, we don't have to have a search always associated with a certain crosstab. So if I open up a crosstab, this can have all of this information in here, but it's really what this search is that determines that. So I can set up one crosstab that has all the slice dimensions that I'm going to want, the row dimension that I'm going to start with, and all the data fields and percentages and patient counts, all of the expressions that I want. And I have that saved. And I know that I'm going to use that with a bunch of searches. So do that. Create one and add a bunch of searches to it. So in this case, we can go into the search and say add searches to object. Here's the crosstab that we're adding description. And then we'll say, here's, I want to add a couple other searches, so we'll say all task owners, and that's now in there. So when I go to open the search, I've got 2 searches already set up with this. The same goes for worksheets. If you are looking at, you've created your crosstab, it's about encounters, and then you only change out the search to look at providers in a given site, as well as, maybe that it's arrived and it's between the 1st of January and the 30th of June for the current year. And you know that you'll want to look at some information about the patients who made up the total number of encounters. We want to know more about whether there was some follow-up for the encounters. And you can create a bunch of different worksheets, and as I showed you, you can associate those with this as well. But remember that with any crosstab, it's not necessarily going to be used for a specific site. So you might just call this by site encounters by provider, and then have in the description some of the other slice dimensions that you have here, because it's not necessarily going to be associated to site 1 or site 2. So that's what I have on Crosstabs today. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, I'll take a look at those now through the questions pane. And again, thank you very much. I do have one more poll that I want to post. Just if there's any other services that you would like from Galen Healthcare, if you're interested, we can provide you with all sorts of services, but we'll have somebody get in touch with you if you're not working with us at this point. All right. Let's take a look at the Q&A here. All right. The question that we have here is, how do you create a search to get all encounters that do not have a note? And this, I'm not positive that I can answer this right off the top of my head, but I'll take a look at this system right now. Go into our search, and we'll look at patient and then encounters. I know that there is a lot of stuff in here, and I can probably put together a piece that would, you can probably do this at least through SQL, but I'm just going to take a quick look through appointments. It may be under provider as well. I'd have to look at how these are linked in the database. But let me take a quick look through here. I don't see note in here. Let me do a quick keyword search. Some stuff in M template. So I don't. This is. I think I'm just going to have to hold off on. We will get back to you on that question regarding the note piece. But let's see if we have other questions here. So the next question is there a way to do formula like those in Excel? For instance, the number of days between when a result was received and when a provider actually verified the result. So we can look at some information on the result side, and I realize that you can't see what I'm doing right now, as it's just an interesting quirk with the software that I'm using here. But we have some verified fields here on result, and you can set up, if you use something like the verify, like the date and time for a result, and when it was received, like the verified date and time, you can create a formula. Let me share the screen again so you can see what I'm doing here. All right, and we can go into expressions, and if you've set up something in your data fields here for either if you've done a link group, which is a more advanced piece of Crosstabs, or if you're just looking at these fields, we can go into result, and we can use math functions here. We've got all of the standard operators and we can go into verify dates and then clinical dates. And you can set this up. You can just do a mathematical formula using probably the clinical date and time result field and the verify date and time field. So these are available here within analytics if you want to build a formula for something like that. Let's see what else we've got here in the questions. So I don't see any other questions at this point, but if you have any, please share them in the Q&A pane. Thank you. So at this point, it looks like that's all the questions. So again, thank you for attending one of the Galen webcasts, and have a great afternoon.